My name is Peter and I work with Raj corporate banking wise, and I also work investment banking, etc. I've been doing this for around about 15 years, which is also mildly scary. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the world of macroeconomics. And it's the type of stuff that whether you want to know about it or you don't want to know about it, it has an impact on your life. Yeah? And the world at the moment is driven mainly by macroeconomic data. Yeah? So therefore, whether or not the Democrats and the Republicans are speaking to each other or not has an impact on everybody else. What's happening here as far as our own prospects has an impact on what's going to happen to interest rates. That then has an impact on our mortgage, etc., etc. Yeah? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the world of macroeconomics. Yeah? So the first couple of slides just talk about what we have to use, and then we're going to look at what the governments are trying to achieve, and then we're going to look at how they attempt to achieve that. Yeah? So therefore, what are their targets? What tools do they have at their disposal in order to try and reach those targets? And we're going to have an opinion on whether or not they are reaching those targets. Can they do anything different to try and reach the targets or whatever? So, first thing is, and the problem that they have, bless them, and I know that we like to have a pop at our politicians and whoever, but the problem is that this car, which I'm not sure is still manufactured, but this car is the economy, yeah? So therefore, what you've got is you've got two people driving it. I don't know which one actually holds the steering wheel, but you've got two people driving it effectively in the UK, and they're trying to keep this thing in a straight line. But the problem is the only information they get to help them steer this car is historic or recent information, yeah? So they're trying to go forwards, but the only map they've got tells them where they've been. Yeah, everybody acts that's the issue they've got. And we've got recent, I would say most information is kind of relatively old. So the people who are making decisions now on where the car should go without knowing where they are now. All they know is where they were 3 months ago, 4 months ago. Yeah? So that's the problem they've got. And what that can potentially lead to is I fixed something that was a problem 3 months ago that's kind of fixed itself. Yeah? And then if I try and fix that now, I create another problem. Yes, everybody, that's the issue that the decision makers kind of have. And I know that there was a Prime Minister recently that mentioned boom and bust was a thing of the past. I don't think he's shown to be exactly true with that particular thing. Yeah? And when they make decisions, if they slow down the economy too much, then we'll go into a recession. If they speed the economy up too much, then we've also got issues. They want the economy just to move kind of slowly. Yeah? Everybody comfortable with that? So that's the issues that they have. And the world of economics, my 9-year-old helped me design this particular slide. She's showing her artistic bent. And what we've got is we've got macroeconomics, which apparently comes from the Greek for big, yeah? And that looks at international and big picture stuff. So when people are talking about macroeconomics, they're looking at countrywide stuff. When we look at microeconomics, then you are looking at the economics of the household and the firm. Yeah? So therefore, that, just in case it comes up on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, that's Greek for small. Yeah? So that's Greek for small, that's Greek for big. Yeah? So therefore, big picture stuff is macro, micro is small picture stuff. So if we're interested in how Vodafone sets its pricing for whatever package it's offering, that's microeconomics. Yeah? If we're looking at what the UK needs to do to get itself out of recession, that is macro. Yeah? And our main focus here is going to be there. Yeah? Now, in the world that we're in, as far as the banking world, then the people who are kind of solely focused on macroeconomics are what we call our rates divisions. Yeah? So therefore, the rates divisions are the guys who are looking at how much we should buy UK government bonds for, or American government bonds, or whatever else. Yeah? And that is fundamentally driven by the macro side of things. Whereas if you are in the credit or the equity world, then you're interested in both, because macro factors will impact on Tesco's ability to sell stuff, but Tesco and how it runs itself also will impact on it. Yeah? So therefore what we've got is, we've got the big picture, we've got the small picture. The key focus at the minute is big picture, because if we don't get the big picture right, then our little gingerbread house becomes slightly irrelevant. Yeah? If capitalism disappears due to the fact that whatever the Americans decide not to vote for whatever it is and all of these different things, then this is less of a problem. And if governments get into trouble, then there's very little the Tesco's and the Walmarts of this world can do to keep us going, is a thought at the moment. Yeah? So we're going to focus on this side, the macro side of the world. And the next slide is everybody's favorite slide, because it's got nothing on it. And whenever anybody brings up a slide that's got nothing on it, at that point in time you look around the table and you think, do these people know anything about what this guy's talking about? Because he's going to ask me to think about something. Yeah? I've already had my croissant, so therefore I can relax, but what's going on, if you like? So governments around the world have generally got three aims. Yeah? So therefore they will use their central banks and they will use their policies in order to try and achieve these aims. Yeah? And then what we've got when we have an aim is we've got to be able to measure it. Yeah? So therefore we've got to be able to measure whether we are achieving this aim or not. And then we've got to have an idea of what success looks like. Yeah? So that's what we're going to look at. So the first thing we're going to think about is, what do we think the three aims of the governments around the planet are as far as the macroeconomic climate is concerned? Anybody? If you know one, volunteer early. Then you can just sit back, glance around at everybody, just say, I've got one in the back, yeah? Anybody, any idea? Inflation. I heard, so therefore inflation. So what we've got is, inflation is a fairly key thing that we're trying to measure. What they will talk about is, they will talk about price stability. Yeah? So inflation is price stability. And what we want is, we want the people who are living under our custodianship, they should be able to buy whatever they want, whenever they want, and not be worried about not being able to do it. Yeah? So therefore, that's inflation. So that's one. There's two left. Growth. Yeah? So therefore, growth. We want our economy to grow. Yeah? So we want the UK to be constantly bigger than it was before. Yeah? Why is that? That's a good question. The reason we want our economies to grow is because we believe that if we grow, then the quality of life of the inhabitants in the country gets better. Whether that's a reasonable belief or not, but that's the belief. So therefore, as we continue to grow, we all get a bit wealthier, and instead of having a black and white television that you can't focus on, you now have HD, which is mildly scary. Yeah? So therefore, and that's what we believe growth brings. It means that the people who live here have a better quality of life. Yeah? Now, whether that's achieved depends upon whether you kind of believe in that doctrine in a way. Yeah? And there are other people around the planet who don't fully subscribe to that point of view, if you like. But that's one of the reasons why we like growth, because our wealth grows with it. Yeah? Is that okay? That's a general logic. And there's a much deeper discussion that goes behind whether or not that is sensible or reasonable or whatever else. But that's what we've bought into at the moment. And the issue I think we've got at the moment is that, and again, we're probably from the same generation, the next generation to us is probably going to be the first generation for an awful long time that may be worse off than we were. And that's the issue that we've got. Up till now, it's kind of been happening. The next generation is materially better off. Whether that makes you happier or not is a different matter, but you're materially better off. the next generation to us may not be materially better off. And that's the issue that we've got to try and overcome. Yeah. So inflation, growth, interest is, I'm going to put that up there because that's going to appear later. Yeah. Interest rates are a tool that we use to try and manage these things. Yeah. So therefore, I'm going to keep it there because I think it's definitely a good point, but we'll look at it a bit. I'm from the northeast, so people from a place called Jarrow decided to go for a little amble somewhere, employment, yeah? So therefore, we want our people to be employed, yeah? Generally speaking, these are the three aims that we've got. So what we want is we want our prices to be relatively stable. As a nation, we want to grow, and as a nation, we want the majority of our people to be actively doing something. Yeah, is everybody comfortable with that? That's the macroeconomic aims of most nations. Yeah, I do accept that not all nations have fully bought into capitalism or whatever, but that's the general view of it. So, does anyone know how we measure these things? So if we look at inflation, how do we measure inflation? It's a 3-letter acronym. So CPI, the Consumer Price Index. Yeah? So CPI is the Consumer Price Index. Yeah? The RPI is the Retail Price Index. Okay then, so we've got CPI and we've got RPI. RPI, so what inflation is an increase in the cost of buying a basket of goods. Yeah, so therefore, if a basket of goods cost £1 last year and it costs £1.03 this year, then that's 3% inflation. Yeah, everybody cool with that? Now the maths behind it may be slightly clever, but that's generally what it is. Now, the difference between CPI and RPI is what's in the basket of goods, is probably the big difference. CPI does not have housing costs in there. Yeah, so your mortgage, your council, what's it called? Council tax or whatever, but is it still called? Anyway, that. So those things are not in there, but they are in there. Yeah? But what is very amusing is when you have a target, there are two ways of hitting that target. One of them is by having economic stability to hit that target. The other way is to change the target. Yeah, is everybody cool with that? So therefore, we used to be measured against RPI. Now we're measured against CPI. There are kind of a couple of reasons for that. One, CPI is more of a global measure, so we can compare ourselves with Europe and everybody else with CPI. RPI isn't. The other one is, because of what's in the basket and the maths behind it, RPI generally is higher than CPI. Yeah? So if I'm giving you a number and you know that number needs to be about 2%, let's say, then I've got more chance of hitting it with that than with that. Yeah? And the other thing is, there are people who work for the government, if you like, who get a pension from the government, and that is index linked. It used to be linked to RPI, which is bigger. Now it's linked to CPI, which is smaller. So therefore you save a bit of money by doing that. Whether that is right or wrong, we'll leave. We've only got 3/4 of an hour, but that's what we've got, yeah? So therefore, that's what the difference is. Now, what then gets kind of, I personally, and you probably think I should get out more, what gets funny is that we've also got RPI X. And RPI X is a retail pricing index excluding housing costs, yeah? And at the minute, we are developing CPI H. Anybody want to guess what CPI H is? With housing costs, yeah? So what we've got is, we've got 4 things that kind of just go around in a circle, generally, yeah? So the difference between RPI and CPI is housing costs, but we've got RPI X, which doesn't have housing costs in it. We've got CPIH, which does have housing costs in it, yeah? And at that point, it becomes the weighting and the maths behind it, yeah? So for example, CPI has in its basket meat, generally. It's not hugely descriptive. Whereas RPI bizarrely breaks meat down into poultry, pork, etc. Yeah, so therefore there's weird differences like that. I think we can kind of trace when civilization started to move downhill back to when cardigans were removed from the RPI and McDonald's were brought in. Yeah, a world that buys more McDonald's than cardigans is not a good place as far as I'm concerned. So therefore that's what you've got, yeah? Now while we're doing it, it's probably worth success. How do we measure success? What's our target for inflation? I mentioned it because trying to come up with a random number is difficult for somebody like me. So 2%, yeah, and it's plus or minus 1% if the Bank of England gets inflation where it's above 3% or below 1%, then the governor of the Bank of England has got to write a letter to George Osborne. Dear George, really sorry, kind of missed it a bit, yeah? So therefore, that's what you've got. So around the planet, 2% is generally what we think is reasonable. So therefore, prices growing at a per annum rate of 2% is considered stable, yeah? So that's stable, and that is also helping us achieve our other aims, yeah? Because obviously prices increasing by 0% is also stable, but it doesn't help us achieve our other aims, yeah? So a little bit of, that's what we've got. In the UK, where have we been over the last few years? A year ago, a couple of years ago, we've been up to 4-5%, yeah? George and the Bank of England the Bank of England governor at that time were basically pen pals, yeah? They were right every month. And it was I'm assuming it was a very dull letter, cut, paste, change the date, because the reasons were the same as to why it was there, but we had to explain it. So that's where we are aiming for. We'll have a look at where we are now, because I can sense you're all thinking, oh, that's what we're aiming for. Where are we now? What do we do? That's next, though, so you can think, where are we? And then you'll do that. So growth, how do we measure growth? GDP is how we measure growth, and that is gross domestic product. Yeah? Now there are many ways in which a country can measure growth. Yeah? There's GNP, all of them are three-letter acronyms. I think the fundamental thing is it's got to be a three-letter acronym, the rest of it's all right. So GDP, gross domestic product, this is how much we make as a country. Yeah? Basically speaking, that's what we're looking for. Now, how we measure it is by looking at the other side. Yeah? So we could measure this by writing to every single company that makes stuff, and when I say make, I also include provide services. Yeah? So therefore, we write to every single bank, every single insurance company, every single manufacturer, and we say, what did you make? And they could fill a form in and send it back. But we decide not to go down that route. We think it's easier if we measure what we've made by how much we've bought. Yeah? So it's kind of the other side of the coin. If somebody makes something, somebody's got to buy something. Yeah? Does everybody see that logic? And what we do is we kind of split what we've bought into the key people who buy the stuff. Yeah? And there are three groups that we split it into. Anybody, who do you think as a generic group buys lots of stuff? I think there's a group of you in here. What do we call you? We call you retailers, yeah? So therefore you. So what we do is we say, what do you spend on stuff? Yeah? I believe I have helped our economy fairly recently because I've spilled tea on our new carpet. Yeah, so we're going to have to replace that quicker than we were going to. So as we rip up our carpet and spend on stuff, then but that's not retail. Who's that? If Fitch Learning buys a new carpet, what group do we put people like Fitch Learning into? So companies or whatever, yeah? So therefore we've got retailers, we've got companies buying stuff. And who's the third one? So anybody who manufactures stuff is going to be in companies. The government, yeah? So is everybody, so the government is the third one, yeah? So therefore what we do is we say how much do we spend, how much do companies spend, and how much the government spend. Now in order to avoid double counting, when companies spend money by paying us salaries, we ignore it. Yeah, because as everybody see, that will come under what we spend, because we might not spend it all. So therefore, it's what we spend, it's assets that companies buy, and it's stuff that governments buy. And in order to grow, we need these people to buy more than they bought last year. Yeah, everybody happy with that? The government, are they footloose and fancy-free with their spending at the minute? No, austerity reigns, yeah? So therefore, they're trying to cut back. Companies, they've got the money, but they just don't want to spend it because nobody else is spending it. Yeah, is the issue we've got. The key driver is us. We are about 60% of the spending in this country. So if we spend, we're all right. If we don't spend, we're not. That's why poor Mr. Cameron, a couple of years ago, when he said that everybody should start saving and paying off their debt, immediately had to retract it, bless him, because even though that may be sensible advice, that's rubbish for the economy, yeah? If we start saving and not spending, then we ain't growing. And if we're not growing, then we are sad. So therefore, I think he said, within limits or something like that, yeah? So therefore, if you can go to sleep with the level of debt you've got, you're all right. If you can't go to sleep, then you might want to think about it. It's generally the logic we've got. So we are a huge part of this, yeah? But if we buy something, that doesn't necessarily mean that we've made it. Yeah, does everybody see that? If my daughters have an iPad, because I am at one with the youth, that isn't made here. My daughter, I don't think the youngest one's gone. Was that made here? No, that was probably made in America, yeah? So we have spent money on stuff that UK PLC didn't make. Does anybody know what it's called if we buy it from somewhere else? It's an import, yeah? So therefore what we do is we add what we have spent. We also add what people in other countries have spent on stuff that we've made, but we take off any imports that we have bought, yeah? And that will give us what we have made, yeah? And we need this to grow, yeah? So this is a kind of our GDP, and we need that to grow. So it's what we spend, machines that companies buy, potholes that the government fill in, exports, so cars that are made in the UK that are bought outside, that counts as us making. But if we're buying a BMW that might be made somewhere else, then that doesn't count as us making it. Yeah? Everybody hunky-dory with that? So we need that to grow is the fundamental thing. Any questions on that? Can I just point out that there are a number of ways in which we can do it, but most of the planet uses this. Yeah? They will announce it, and then after a month they will revise it because they will get new information. Yeah? So as with all of economics, they give you a number and it's kind of an approximation, if you like, because we don't really know. How much do you think we want to grow by? Any idea? There isn't a target for this, yeah? But it's assumed that if you grow at around about 2 to 3%, then that is kind of all right. And that is what people will call real growth, yeah? Because GDP is measured after removing inflation, yeah? So if we spend more due to the fact that prices have just gone up through inflation, that isn't us making anymore. Does everybody see that? If something cost £1 last year and £1.03 this year, I've spent £1.03, I've spent 3% more. but we've made the same amount of stuff. Yeah? So therefore, we need that to grow a little bit more than inflation. Yeah? This measure is after inflation, which means we've stripped inflation out, which means we've got to decide what inflation we use to strip out, which means we can manage the figures, should we wish. Yeah? There's some American people very upset with their growth numbers because they believe their growth numbers are higher than they would be if they used a reasonable level of inflation to bring it back down again. But then there's always somebody upset about kind of something. But that's what you've got, yeah? So we want to grow, and if we grow, then that means there's more money around here. That means we feel better about ourselves. That means life is good. Is GDP measured the same way globally? I would say most of the ones that I have seen, yes. But it's much harder to measure in some countries than other countries. Yeah? So therefore, the UK, we're an island, not that big an island. Most of it is fairly well populated. If you go to somewhere like China, where you have huge swathes of rural China where access may be difficult, the infrastructure may not, then how do you measure it? You've just got to have a way of measuring it. Yeah? Now, there are some people in America and elsewhere who think China just make these numbers up. Yeah? Which is probably because there may be a bit of jealousy there, because they've got growth figures that we can only dream about, but also that's the issue. If you are in a part of the world where infrastructure technology is not universal, then yeah, I do accept that we've got the odd farmhouse just up a lane somewhere up in the northeast that you might, but there's not that many of them. Whereas in certain countries, there's huge swathes of the country. And this one is probably the hardest to measure at that point. Yeah? So therefore, how do you think we measure unemployment? It's people who are actively looking for work. Yeah? So therefore, what we do is we look at people who are actively looking for work. And the people who do it, what they do is you've got to have been out of work for 4 weeks. You've got to be available to work. So therefore, if you have decided to stay at home to bring up your family, you're not available for work. Yeah? So therefore, you are not unemployed. So you've got to have been out of work for 4 weeks. You've got to be able to start within 2 weeks and all of these other things. Yeah? Now, there is another number that people also look at, which is the claimant's number. But the claimant's number is a lot lower than the unemployment figure that is announced. Yeah? Because there are some people who are either A, not allowed to claim because they don't tick whatever boxes, or they don't want to claim. Yeah? So claimants will be lower than the unemployment figure that is mentioned. Okay, so where do they get the data from? The higher figure from? Every month or 3 months, I can't remember now, 50,000 households in the UK. We talk to them. Are you at work? Yes, but it's 10 o'clock. Why not? Anyway, it doesn't matter. They have a conversation. Who's in there? Who's working? And then they just extrapolate it. Yeah? So that's what they're looking at. So if we use, so I'm assuming that the 50,000 households are spread around the UK. Yeah? And then they will use that. And if we use the same information again and again and again, only adapting it if circumstances make us adapt it, then at that point it becomes a reasonable measure. That's all it ever is, a reasonable measure. Yeah? So therefore that's what you've got. That's what we do. My household's not in it. I've written letters to try and get in there, but they won't let me in. Yeah? So that's what you do. So there's claimants, there is, and in America, the non-farm payroll is one of the biggest pieces of information that you get in the marketplace. Non-farm is not because nobody likes farmers. It's because farming is seasonal. If there are crops to chop down, they employ people. If there are not crops to chop down, they don't. Yeah, does everybody see that logic? So that's what you've got. Now in China, their employment measure, they basically only look at, they don't do any analysis of the rural areas. That's because the cost of doing it and the benefit of doing it is, I personally think it's a no-brainer. There's no point in doing it. So their unemployment figures are taken just from, I think it's on the east coast of China, all of the suburban areas there. And anybody who is in rural China is assumed to be employed. Yeah? So therefore, the rest of it is just these guys here. And again, some people get really upset about that. So one, I think they should get out more, but they do get really upset about this. And I personally, and again, I'm aware that I am only some bloke from the north, and why do you care what my view is, but I personally don't think that's the worst. Of all of the choices you've got, if you're in rural China, I'm assuming if you don't work, then your quality of life ain't that good. Yeah, so I'm assuming if you're of a working age, you will be contributing in some way. And that's what their view is. And what do you think success is? And they measure it in unemployment. Yeah, so they will give you a percentage of unemployment. What would we consider to be a good number in the long run? And then we'll talk about what we think is a good number in the short run. 4% is considered full employment. So if you have 4% unemployment in most jurisdictions, they would consider that to be full employment. Yeah? So there are people who are moving in between jobs, there are people who are being trained for new jobs, and there are people who just simply don't want to work. Yeah? Everybody hunky-dory with that? So that's a good number. Yeah? And what really upsets the people, again going back to China, is quite often their unemployment rate comes in at about 4.1%. And it really annoys other governments around the world who are struggling with these really big numbers, and China hits the mark every single time. And they'll say, but they're making it up. And you're like thinking, well, focus on your bit and let's not worry about their bit. But that's what you've got. And you can check these numbers. If you say you're growing at 6%, then there may be an argument that your usage of electricity should go up by around about 6%. So if you tell the planet you're growing at 6%, but your usage of electricity, which is more quantitative, has dropped by 20%, does everybody see you've kind of got to explain yourself at that point? So therefore, there are ways in which you can kind of check whether this is reasonable. Okay, so these are the targets. This is what we consider success. Where are we? Where is good old Blighty in this whole thing, yeah? So what do you think our inflation rate is? What do you think our GDP is? What do you think our unemployment is? Anybody any idea?
Well, unemployment, isn't that 10% or over 10%?
Is it?
8%.
Yeah, I think unemployment at the minute is, and obviously we don't have to go in that order. I'm happy to go. So 7.7% is what our unemployment is. Sadly, our youth unemployment is a lot higher, and that's the number that I think our youth unemployment is around about 11%. And that's the number that a lot of continents are worried about. So in Spain, it's closer to 50%, the youth unemployment. And once you lose a generation, then it's very, very difficult to get it back, and that's the worry that you have. So 7.7% is in our unemployment. Now, this has become a focal point now, yeah? We've moved away from George Osborne. We now have the Canadian, known as Mark Carney, who's running the Bank of England, and he's saying that this is our main focus, yeah? He's stating he's not going to do anything until that number gets to 7%. Yeah, Obama, the American guy, he's got the same thing, yeah? So the Fed have said, and again, it'll be Ms. Yellen moving forward, but Bernanke has said they're not doing anything until employment reaches a certain level. So this has moved away. We were very focused on that. For the last few years, we haven't told anybody we're not focused on it, but it's become obvious we haven't been focused on it. But now we are giving what they call forward guidance. The Bank of England is telling the market what's got to happen before they do something. Yeah? And this is their aim. So this needs to be down to 7% before they think about changing anything. Yep, pretty hunky-dory with that. It is moving downwards. About a year ago it was 8.4%. So we are moving slowly but surely towards that particular aim. And one hopes it's because there's more people working rather than we've said anybody with a vowel in their name is not allowed to be unemployed or whatever, yeah? So hopefully we haven't changed the rules. Hopefully it's more people who are kind of working. What about our GDP? Is a reasonable, now GDP you get two numbers. We've got one that is 0.7% and one that is 1.3%, yeah? Now this one is our growth as compared to the last quarter, yeah? So therefore this is quarter two stuff that we've got. So quarter two grew by 0.7% against quarter one, yeah? So we've made 0.7% more after removing inflation in quarter two than we did in quarter one. Now sometimes certain quarters, by definition, you make less and do less. So the other number is how much we've made against the same quarter last year, yeah? So what we've got is we've got the growth in between then and now, if you like, yeah? So how much did we make in last year? How much do we make this year? What's it grown by? Cool. But again, that is a key aim for us. We've got to grow. We are very worried that we are going to stop growing. Yeah, we need to grow. So Japan stopped growing for decades, and everybody's worried that we will fall into a similar trap, if you like. So we're looking at that to try and make it a bit better. Yeah, so we need this, as we said, about 2 to 3% would be nice. We are moving towards it. We're expecting the next GDP figures to be a little bit better, but recently our industrial production has been a little less than we expected. Services were a lot better than expected. So you've got all of these things come together to give us this. Yeah, we are very much a service-based economy. We're trying to move to making stuff again, but it's the services that's probably our key driver. And then our inflation, which should be 2%, but in all, it's 2.7%. Yeah? So does he have to write a letter? No. See, that's bad. If you're buying shares in Royal Mail, you want him to be writing more letters, but he doesn't have to write a letter, so therefore, that's no letter. 2.7%, we're moving downwards. This, as I said, used to be our core aim. Now we believe we've got bigger fish to fry. And we've kind of ignored inflation for a long, long time. Inflation was at 5% and we didn't really do anything about it. Yeah? So we just kind of left it because we were trying to work on these. So what we're trying to do, our aim is to get this up, this down, and then we'll tackle that. Yeah? Everybody? And what Mark Carney has said is that's how we're going to judge ourselves going forward on this for the time being. This comes down before we do anything. Yeah? Now, what we've got to think about is what tools do they have in their locker in order to help them do this? Yeah? Everybody hunky-dory with that? Now, there are two parts of our infrastructure that can help us out. There's the Bank of England and there is the government. Yeah? And what we've got is, we've got two different policies. Yeah? We've got monetary policy, which is what the Bank of England does to try and stimulate the economy. Yeah? So that's, in the past it was Mervyn King, who has the same name as a professional darts player, just in case you was watching Sky Sports. Mervyn King was playing, thought, wow, what's the governor of the Bank of England doing? However, he walked out and he wasn't the same guy. So I thought he was multi-talented, he's not. So he's gone, and now we've got Mark Carney. Yeah, so Mark Carney's arrived, and he helped Canada, apparently, through the choppy waters. So therefore, that's the experience that we've brought in, yeah? And then we've got George, and he is looking after the government's attempts to help move the economy, yeah? So he's the Chancellor, and he will do that. So when Mark Carney does something, they call it monetary policy, yeah? So monetary policy is when the Bank of England does stuff to try and help us achieve our aims. When the government or the Treasury does something, then that's called fiscal policy. Now, these two should work hand in hand, obviously, yeah? So therefore, what we've got in the Bank of England, interest rates. And if we just think about it, if you want to make people spend more money, what do you do with interest rates? Do you lower them or do you increase them? Lower them, yeah? So you lower interest rates. That means it's easier to borrow, or cheaper to borrow, should I say, and therefore you're more willing to spend, okay? Now, what are our interest rates at the moment? Does anyone know what the base rate is? It's 0.5%. So what that means is if a bank wants to borrow money from the government, it costs them 0.5% through this, the way in which they can borrow it, yeah? So that's been 0.5% for a number of years, but does everybody accept that if the government of the Bank of England, if the Bank of England, states we're going to cut interest rates, we're going to cut interest rates to 0.25%, is that going to make all of you think, brilliant, I wasn't going to move house, now I will? That three-piece is going to be changed. Or are you going to think that's a really small number and it's still a really small number? Everybody, it can't be. Whereas if that is at 4% and we drop it to 3.5%, that might stimulate. Yeah, does everybody? That's what we've got. So this tool has been removed. Yeah. So that tool, if you think about it, has been sent away to get fixed. So I can't use it anymore. Yeah. There's nothing really there to it, which is why, and you should be thankful that you are living through an era where we've had to come up with a new tool. Yeah? In the good old days where we just grew serenely and everybody was happy, they didn't even know what quantitative easing was. Now, you've witnessed it. You've been through it. The grandchildren will say, what's quantitative easing? I remember the days, yeah? And that is monetary policy. And generally, quantitative easing is making money easier to get. That's what quantitative easing is. So the Bank of England is pushing money into the market. So the terms that the economists might use is increasing money supply. Yeah? So what they're doing is they're buying assets from people and giving them cash for those assets. Now those assets may be bonds, the government or whatever else. And the idea is that that money flows in, and then what people will do is spend that money on other stuff. Yeah? So therefore, let's say we've got a Fidelity or whoever, yeah? I apologize, I should have picked somebody who's... But Fidelity. I buy the bonds off Fidelity. Fidelity then get the cash. Interest rates are shockingly low. They're not going to put that into a deposit account or whatever. Let's say that they then buy shares in whoever. Then that money, or new shares that these companies are issuing to try and raise, that money then flows into the economy. We then make stuff, people then get paid more, and then we grow. Yeah, does everybody see? That's what we hope happens with this thing. So what they're doing is they're removing the block to growth that is the lack of money. So if we're not growing now, it's nothing to do with people not having enough money. We've made that money available. Yeah? They talk about printing, it is, but if the Bank of England doesn't kind of need to, it is effectively printing money, but it's just, all they're doing is they're tapping in a number into a computer. Yeah? Because the money that is flowing around, our wealth, is huge relative to the number of pounds and coins and whatever else. That's the thing. So therefore, if I have £1,000 and I deposit it into a bank account, the bank generally has to keep 100 of that money, then they can lend out the other 900. And then somebody else will spend that, and what you do is you have this multiplier effect. So all they're doing is they're easing the amount of the money that's there. They call it printing money because I think conceptually it's an easier thing to, rather than just keying in a number. The assets they get are the bonds that they buy back, which initially was bonds in the government. So what you had was the Bank of England buying UK government bonds from people and then hoping that that money, another way is I give the money to Fidelity, Fidelity then deposit it with RBS, RBS then lend it out to somebody who buys a car and it starts to grow. But the problem is a lot of people have thought, brilliant, I'll just keep the cash and I'll just buy something else that's safe, and that's not necessarily going to. And the other problem is, whether it's working or not is really difficult to judge, because you would have to know what would have happened had we not done it to judge its success, which you don't know. So therefore, that's the issue around it. They're saying we're better off with it than without it. But the problem is, at some point, we are going to have to stop printing money, to use that. Now, America announced that they were thinking about stopping printing money because the economy was a lot better than they thought. And again, I'm an old man and I like things to be simple. Economy good, share prices up. Yeah? That's the way it's been since I first started reading the FT as a 3-year-old. Yeah? That's the way it's been. What happened was we announced that the economy was going up, share prices plummeted because Bernanke mentioned, I'm going to stop doing this. They called it tapering, which means he's going to stop. And all of the markets, and the good thing about the markets is they're consistent. They act like a 5-year-old. Yeah? So therefore, we've said, you can't have that chocolate. They've gone, no, I want the chocolate. You can't have the chocolate, no, I want the chocolate. Now we've given them the chocolate. And again, I don't consider myself a brilliant parent, but I worked out fairly early on, if you say no, 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 yes, then generally they scream louder and longer. And the problem is, as they grow, they get fitter, so they can do it for longer. And we have just done that to the markets in America. We've just let them scream. We've said, all right, then, go for it. At some point, we're going to have to taper. Now, what we have then said was, okay, then, they're not going to have the chocolate all the time, but let's give them a view as to when the chocolate is going to stop. And that's the unemployment numbers. So once it hits 7%, I am going to start to taper. Yeah? So you know that's going to happen, and I'm not going to change my mind this time, because everybody always believes you when you've changed your mind every other time. But we're not going to change our mind, and that's what they're trying to do. So we need to reduce that, because the problem is, if there's a lot of money sloshing about, then the issue is that we then have worries about this. Yeah? If there's lots of money sloshing around, everybody's got easy credit, then we all want to buy stuff. We can't make more stuff, so therefore we're willing to pay more to get it, and inflation is an impact. Yeah? But what the market is really worried about, and I'm kind of with it, is we have never, ever, ever tapered quantitative easing. So nobody has a clue what it looks like. Yeah? And in the current climate, anything new is not interesting, it's scary. Yeah? And therefore we're scared. Let's just keep printing money. Let's just keep doing it. But that's got to change. And what will happen is we will stop this. The government will stop pumping money in. They will unwind that. Then interest rates will start to rise. And then we'll be back to normal, hopefully. Probably when I'm about 90 and not really aware of what's going on. Yeah, but that's what the monetary policy is going to do. Now over here, we've got good old George, or as Obama knows him, Jeff. Yeah, so therefore, what we've got is, we've got this guy here, and he is running the government policy. And the government policy is all about trying to manage this. Yeah, a balanced budget is when I spend as much as I bring in. Yeah, is everybody happy with that? So whatever I collect in tax, I spend. That is a balanced budget. If I am spending more than I'm collecting in tax, that means I have a deficit. Yeah, that means I've got to fund it from somewhere else. Or If I'm not spending as much as I'm getting in tax, I have a surplus. Yeah, does everybody? So where do you think we are in the UK? Are we balanced, deficit, surplus? We're deficit, yeah? Oh, we were. Oh, yeah, we've been in surplus. I think the Labour government in the 1990s was in surplus, and we were paying debt back. That probably just because we were pumping more oil than you can ever imagine, and we were doing it. But we're going to be in surplus the next Parliament, as far as George is concerned. Yeah, we're not going to have any street lighting, but we're going to be in surplus at that particular point, and that's the thing we've got. Now, not all governments are in the same predicament. I would imagine if you looked at the United Arab Emirates, then they may be but they've got this black stuff that apparently is quite important, and that's what you've got. So therefore, this is the issue we have, and the problem is he needs more money to continue the spending. More money means tax. More money, tax either means we have to change the global tax laws so that Starbucks pays the level of tax that we think it should pay. I'm mentioning Starbucks just because it was in the paper. I'm sure there are. The thing is, they haven't done anything illegal. All they've done is being efficient. And as a director of Starbucks, that's my duty. My duty is not to make sure that the UK government gets as much tax. My duty is to make my shareholders wealthy. So the way in which we make them pay tax is change the rules. But you've got panorama programs that are following tax advisors around who are now the new drug dealers. Yeah? So tax advisors saying they were advising people on how to save tax. Criminal nightmare. Yeah? I think we're slightly overreacting, but that's what you've got. Now, the problem is if we tax companies more, they spend less, because that will have an impact on growth. If they tax us more, we spend less. That has an impact on growth. So what George has done is he's deciding to try and cut spending. But all he's managed to do so far, and this is kind of factual rather than saying he's doing well or badly, is he's just managed to cut the deficit a bit. Yeah? That means our debt is growing. Yeah? It's just not growing as much as it was before. So we've got debt that is about 90% of our GDP. Yeah? So everything we produce, 90% of that number gives our debt. Yeah? And I haven't committed to memory. I think it's about 1.7 trillion we've got. So no, sorry, George. 1.3 trillion is our debt. Yeah? And our deficit last year was 82 billion. So we spent 82 billion more than we collected in last year. That's not considered optimal. Yeah? So therefore, Japan is significant. The key thing is, who do I owe the money to, and how long have I got to pay it? Yeah? So if I had 1.7 trillion on my credit card as a government, that's bad. But if I've got 1.7 trillion on a mortgage, that's less of an issue. And the UK, last time I looked, had an average lifetime of its debt of around about 13 or 14 years, which means we've got more time to play with. A lot of the peripheral countries, or the smaller countries in Europe, their average debt life was about 4 or 5 years. Yeah? So that's not that great. Japan has debt of significantly more than its GDP, but most of that is owed to its residents. Yeah? So therefore, that kind of makes everybody relax a bit more. Yeah? So therefore, it depends who owes you the money and what they will do. So China will own a reasonable amount of our debt, America, and if we default, kind of what happens. Yep. Now, the one good thing we've got that Greece doesn't have is we know the code to our photocopier. So we can print as many pounds as we want. So if we owe somebody money, we can pay them. What that will buy you, we don't know. Yeah? Here's £700,000 and you can get one Mars bar with that if you wish. And that's the problem if you print too much. Whereas Greece doesn't have the code to the photocopier. It's a European central bank that controls that. And that's the issue you've got. So when countries default, it generally means they haven't got control of their currency, or it means they have borrowed money in another currency. So Argentina couldn't pay the debt, but it was the dollar debt. Yeah? Argentina had a training sailing vessel that went to one of the African countries, and the hedge funds of America took the boat from Argentina because Argentina owed them money. Yeah? And that's kind of, if you're in default, you owe somebody money, then they have a right to recourse, and that's the kind of the worry. But everybody believes we're less likely to do that. So what he's trying to do, and this is just my final point, what he is trying to do is, given the situation that we're in, lots of debt and a deficit, yeah? And what a lot of people don't understand is the debt and the deficit. So the debt is how much we owe, the deficit is how much what we owe is growing by every year. Yeah? So he's trying to get the deficit down, and then he'll try to pay it off. He's done that by making cuts in government spending, which apparently won't impact on our life, rather than increasing tax. Carney's trying to do the same. And the reason they're doing it is because we want this to be smaller, and we want this to be bigger. And in the end, we want that to be 2. Yeah, is everybody? So therefore, the government is taking action to try and steady ourselves. And the reason, and nobody can argue with the logic behind the reason, you might argue with how he's doing it. George Osborne is aware that the less creditworthy the United Kingdom is, the more expensive it is for us as a country to borrow money. Yeah? So if he can make everybody think that we're good and we're going to cut our deficit, then it's cheaper for us to borrow. Yeah? And that's what he's aiming for. And if it's cheaper for us to borrow, then we can invest more. And if we can invest more, then our unemployment kind of falls. Okay? Is that? Okay. So therefore, they would argue that they weren't as bad at doing it as everybody made them out to be. Yeah? And but that's kind of a different discussion. As far as governments are concerned, governments don't want to be rated by these people. And they don't want to be rated by these people because I would argue that they are relatively independent and they're giving a view on what the likelihood, and they just use statistics as to what your GDP to debt is, what your tax income per capita is, all of these different metrics, and they say, well, a good country looks like this, a bad country looks like this. And obviously on top of that, you've got what commodities have you got there, what of this you've got there, and they will just give a view on how likely it is that this government will be able to pay its debt back. And they have a view on 2 things: how likely it is to pay its debt back in its own currency, how likely it is to pay its debt back in somebody else's currency, the dollar generally. And if we get rid of them, what do we replace them with? Because if I am going to invest in America, then I need to have an idea as to how creditworthy America is. Now, America telling me I'm not really that interested, I need somebody else to tell me. Now, whether the current system is the best system, I don't know. But if we're going to get rid of Fitch, Moody's, and Standard & Poor's, then who do we replace them with? And nobody's come up with a better idea. And I know that's not always a good reason not to do, but that's about where we are. Okay? I'm aware I've gone on for slightly longer than we said, but any questions on what we've chatted about? The issue with currency is, and you're right, it's all built in. Currency has an impact on price stability. The weaker your currency is, the more expensive your imports are, the more expensive stuff becomes. So that's an issue. So one of the 3 that we're looking for, it's bad. However, a weaker currency also means that my exports are cheaper, which means I may make more. Yeah? So there's 2 sides to that. And the currency is driven by the relative interest rates between the 2 countries. Yeah? So therefore, what a currency that has higher interest rates relative to another currency will attract money in to get those higher interest rates. Now, quantitative easing in order for the UK interest rates to rise, we have got to stop quantitative easing, we've got to unwind quantitative easing, and then we'll think about our rates going up. So whenever a government announces that it's going to continue to quantitative ease, then the market says, well, interest rate rises are a long way away, and that currency will devalue. And that's an impact that we will take into account. So the dollar devalued greatly when they said that that the tapering is, we're not going to do it anymore. Now, a weaker dollar, what a lot of African countries are doing now is raising a lot of debt in the dollar. Yeah, so therefore that's that's got to have an impact on, so therefore their liability is worth less, if you like, if the dollar is weaker. But the currency is just one thing in all of these. They will always go back to this. Yeah, so therefore, apologies. They will always go back to what my decision will do for this. And the currency impacts on two of these directly, and the third one, if we're making more, then we may need more people. And that's what they do. But India is worried about the rupiah, America, the dollar. And then, as far as currency is concerned, you've got the spanner in the works where a country like China will not let its currency move outside a band, which is another thing that upsets a lot of senators in America. But that's what you. Yeah. Any? Because the last thing I just want to mention, because remember we said that we drive the car, we don't know where it's going. The last slide just shows us the information. So there's one slide which talks about exports and imports, but the one that I think needs slight explanation is this is the information that the government is using. Yeah? So the government is using information in order to work out what its gross domestic product is. Yeah? Now the key thing is confidence. How do you find out whether you and I are confident? Because if we're confident, we'll spend more. And if we know we're going to spend more, then that's going to push GDP up. Happy days. How do we know? How do we know whether how do you find out if somebody's confident? Sorry? Ask them. Yeah? Ask them is basically one of the fundamental ways. What's the problem with asking Joe Public whether they're confident or not? Generally, we lie. Yeah? That's the issue that we've got. Most people filling out a survey don't tell the truth. Yeah? I got junk mail on buying yachts for a number of years after I filled a survey in. I must have added a few noughts to my salary or whatever it was. And that's the problem you've got. 60% of your growth is driven by us. A lot of our spending is driven by our confidence, and we don't know how to measure our confidence. Yeah? And they can't come up with There's lots of people who do measure it. One way is how easy is it to park near city centres. So there's one company that does a survey, and if on a Saturday you can park within 3 miles of a major city centre, then we're not confident. If it's 5 miles, then we're confident. Yeah? Does everybody accept that that's more artistic than scientific in its view? But that's how you... Because what you might have is a lot of people who just want the walk. But we can't... Then we find out what we've actually spent. Yeah? But remember, this is after the event. I will tell you that 3 months ago, people spent lots of money. What George and Mark need to know is, when are you thinking about spending money? Yeah? This will tell me what assets companies have bought. What they want to know is, when are they thinking about buying it? Now, this is much better. They have this thing called the PMI, the Purchasing Manager Index, and that is where you ask companies what their spending patterns will look like. Yeah? I remember as an accountant way back when, I think it was still in shillings and pence or whatever, we had to fill a form in saying what we were doing. Now, the good thing about that is I'm not allowed to lie. Yes, this is a legal document that I'm filling in on behalf of the government. So therefore, we have a little bit more interest in that. But, I know I said whose purchasing managers are we more interested in as a globe? So globally, whose purchasing managers buying more will make us happy? And whose purchasing managers buying more will make us indifferent? So who do we need to be growing as much as they've been growing in the past? China. That's it. If the Chinese purchasing managers are happy and they're spending more, then the rest of the globe feels happy. If America is spending more, the rest of the globe feels happy. Yeah, does everybody? They are the drivers of this. We need ours to be buying more, but you'll probably find that ours are buying more if China and America are buying more. And that's what you've got. Now, this is a weird index. 50 means they're buying the same. More than 50 means they're buying more. Less than 50 means they're buying less. Please don't ask me why. But that's what you've got. Yeah? So this is all information that feeds through into the GDP. Yeah?